So if I could invite Paul Krugman, please, and Alexandros Exarchou, please, too. How are you? Very nice to see you. If you go. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to welcome Paul Krugman and Alexandros Exarchou for this section on globalization in a fragmented world. We're going to start by hearing some open remarks from Professor Krugman. As you all know, Nobel laureate, very distinguished professor of economics, and also very well-known columnist and public intellectual in America. So while our theme is globalization in a fragmented world, we may feel free to range a little bit wider than that today since so much is going on. But to start with, please do kick us off with some thoughts on this very troubled world we now live in.
Yeah, and if I can say, I'd rather prefer not to go out, but no, the globalization is one of the least unhappy subjects for me to talk about right now. But anyway, let's talk about where we are right now. A few points to make about globalization, global integration. First point to make is that the world is not flat. Apologies to my New York Times colleague, but there's no technological imperative that says that we have to have a tightly integrated global economy. Globalization does not have to move forwards. In fact, the world was a lot less globalized in 1950 than it had been in 1913. Political divisions, protectionism can very easily roll back the clock on globalization. We got a period of steadily falling barriers to international trade, increased a rules-based international order that left markets quite open. But that was not ever because economists won the argument. It's not the case that economists lectured politicians on David Ricardo and the virtues of free trade and convinced them. What happened instead was that we found mechanisms to harness special interests, to harness national security concerns in the interest of an open economy. And by we, I mean, at least initially, the United States, though increasingly over time, the EU became an important partner in that process. It was, if you like, the global order as it was, as to some extent still is, but may not last, is really one of enlightened mercantilism rather than a true commitment to free trade. That era is over. The only question is how hard the landing is. We are no longer, there are very unlikely to be any major new trade agreements. There's almost certainly going to be significant backsliding. There's going to be substantial economic nationalism, no matter what the political outcomes are in the near future, although how severe it will be depends a lot. Naturally, coming from where I do, I have a very U.S. focus, and God knows, and if anybody wants my views on the coming election, I abstain. I don't know anything that no one else, that lots of other people don't know better. But obviously, if it's a Trump victory, then the United States is going to turn the clock, not turn the clock back to 1950, but turn the clock back to the 19th century. We're going to just see a return of crude protectionism and a complete abdication of whatever role the United States has had in promoting globalization. However, even the Biden administration and Biden or some other Democrat holding the White House, what we're seeing is now a very significant shift towards a much more sophisticated form of economic nationalism. For pretty good reasons. That we have a lot of arguments here between Americans and, well, some economists, but particularly I find that Europeans kind of don't get it, don't understand why Biden doesn't, say comparative advantage is great, free trade is great, and just stop there. Well, there are actually really several good reasons for that. The first is that we learned a lot about the downsides of rapid globalization, or as I sometimes say, hyperglobalization and its discontents. What we failed to, we did have this very rapid growth in trade beginning in the 1980s, kind of stalling out around 2007. What we failed to appreciate, what I failed to appreciate, and I think almost everybody on the political scene failed to appreciate, was how disruptive that kind of rapid growth in trade can be. We focused a lot on what does it do to the overall level of inequality, what does it do to the Gini coefficient, and the answer was not much, but failed to see how disruptive it could be to individual communities. So if you ask what effect did imports from China have on overall US wages, it's probably not a very big number. But that's not much consolation if you are someone who lives in a city in North Carolina that's devoted to the manufacture of furniture, and suddenly that industry disappears in the face of Chinese competition. And it turns out there was quite a lot of that. So the politics of trade turn out to be much more fraught than we realized, and that is really important. Any reasonable political leader needs to take that into account. Second thing is that there are things out there besides globalization, which arguably matter a lot more. So in the United States, one of the things that's at stake in this coming election is the United States has finally taken some real action on climate. It's not everything you'd want. It's not enough, but it's the first major move that we've made. And it's kind of a political miracle that we got even the climate policy we did. As you may know, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Holy Roman Empire of legislation, as in neither Holy nor Roman nor an empire, the Inflation Reduction Act had nothing to do with reducing inflation. It was primarily about promoting green energy. It passed the upper chamber, passed the US Senate by a margin of 0 votes. Tied vote carried by the vice president. It but barely passed. And it was only possible to pass it because it contained a strong element of economic nationalism. It was only because there were a lot of Buy American provisions. And it will survive only because of those provisions, if it survives, because by the time that a future president says, oh, I want to get rid of this, by that time there will be battery factories in Georgia and electric car factories in Kentucky, and there will be interest groups there to defend the climate policy. And so that's just a realistic thing, something that has to be done. That's one major consideration. And in a way, it's in the same spirit as the way that we got this relatively open world order, which is that you don't yell at special interests and tell them that they should not be taken into account. We should only work for the common welfare. You try to harness special interest politics in the interest of the common good, and that's what we did. And if that does some damage to globalization, well, you don't want to be there 15 years from now and say, well, we cooked the planet, but we preserved the rules of the WTO, right? You have to do what you have to do. The last really important thing, I'd say the elephant in the room, but it's actually more the dragon in the room, is national security. Look, if we've here in Europe, you certainly know even more than we do that the world has turned out to be a more dangerous place than we had ever than we acknowledged. I don't think anyone a few years ago was thinking about large-scale conventional war as being something that would make a comeback, but it has. And the national security considerations are now loom really, really large in policy. Not across the board. Nobody cares about national security for the footwear industry, but we do care about it for semiconductors, for advanced computing, and it is necessary to have policies that take that into account. I mean, arguably, we even waited too long. If you want to think about a real economic nightmare for the global economy, think about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. just to be blunt. So much dependence on Taiwan-produced semiconductors. We're actually even legally kind of within our rights. If anybody actually ever reads the GATT, not recommended for light reading, but Article 21, at least as I read it, gives pretty much carte blanche to countries to do whatever they think is necessary to secure themselves, national security reasons. I'm taking a very US perspective, but the EU is, look, the EU is kind of, in many ways, the EU falls very short, as we just heard. On defense issues, the EU doesn't nearly carry its weight. On trade issues, it more or less does. The EU does negotiate as a body on trade. In many ways, the EU and the United States are kind of co-equal partners on international trade. And the EU can play a role in managing this. We're going to have to move away from, we're not going to have the same kind of blanket, globalization is good, let's foster it, that we had before. We'll be lucky if we can hold on to the kind of sophisticated economic nationalism that the current US administration is practicing. We can do this, it will help if we can kind of have an alliance to do so with friendly partners, and that very much includes the EU. If you want my vision of how we can make this work, it would be that we can maybe have a kind of reciprocity where things like subsidies that are motivated either by national security or by climate, that instead of being national, buy American, they can sort of be buy Western alliance, that they can be, that we can make a deal. But basically, if Europe can get itself together to have serious green policies, then the United States and Europe could make some reciprocity so that those policies serve special interests on both sides of the Atlantic. It's going to be very hard. And again, there's a very, very, very substantial risk that we're going to be turning into something much more primitive, that we're going to be in a world of all-out trade war. I was going to say, not 5 years from now, but maybe like 7 months from now. But hoping for the best, just realize that lecturing people about the importance of globalization and free trade is not good enough. You need to find a way to make this actually work in terms of the political economy. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, lots of interesting thoughts there. It won't surprise you that coming from The Economist, we argue for preach the gospel, if you like, of free trade.
You are an example of people who I think are well-meaning but not helpful.
Right. But I'm interested to know, in a way, what you're describing as a paucity of language, that we talk about globalization, but something much more complex is the way the world is moving. And it seems to me a question of where you draw the free trade areas around. Is it narrowly national, or is it something more inclusive among friends and so on? What sort of a world is this, do you think? Or how might it be described better than globalization or non-globalization, something in between?
Look, first of all, let me put, if we do this right, and that's, we could be just doing very stupid, destructive things. But assuming that we have at least some sophistication, first of all, these considerations don't necessarily apply to everything. And in particular, if you want my greatest economic concern, it's that poor countries retain access to global markets. And for the most part, what poor countries need access for are not things that will be terribly relevant, either for climate or national security. If you think, I tend to think of Bangladesh. As people sometimes say, Bangladesh is not a banana republic, it's a pajama republic. Basically, its economy relies upon the export of labor-intensive apparel. There's no plausible national security or climate-related reason why the United States or the EU should have a nationalistic policy with regard to imports of apparel from Bangladesh. So we should be able to carve out of these concerns a large enough space for poor countries to make their way in the world. On the things that are more strategic, on the areas where you either need to be able to say to people, we're not just saving the planet, we're also creating jobs, or the places where you need to say, well, we are building a bulwark against autocratic regimes, you have some combination of friendshoring and nearshoring. Friendshoring is really what I'm talking about with possible deals between the US and the EU. The democratic world, of which I hope my country is still a part a few months from now, can kind of get together and say we're going to try to and help each other on security. And nearshoring, there's just a lot less risk. The fact of the matter is that a strategic goods, semiconductors, whatever else, strategic goods produced in Monterrey, Mexico, are less at risk than strategic goods produced in Taiwan, or worse yet, in Shenzhen. So that there's a range of things. It's not simple national boundaries, or we hope it's not. That's a kind of worst case scenario. But it does mean a lot less of this kind of flat world where it doesn't matter where things are produced.
So one more question, and I want to get your perspective. There's a lot of talk, and you've alluded to it, of the difference that an election might make. But in some respects, there's been quite remarkable continuity in the trade policies between the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration. Very tough on China. They almost outdo each other to try. You could describe perhaps the Biden administration as being more efficient, more effective restrictions on China than the sort of more scattergun policy of the Trump administration. Tariffs are not going away even under a Biden too. So how much is difference narrowly on trade policy do you think there would be depending on who wins the election? Oh,
enormous difference, because although it's true that Biden has preserved the Trump tariffs, that's for the most part is political. To be seen as being soft on China or to be easily accused of it would be political poison. You just can't. We live in that world. In some important ways, the Biden administration has been much tougher on China than Trump ever was. Because it's not motivated by concern about the bilateral trade deficit. It's about strategic industries, and there's pretty harsh policies trying to at least impede China's ability to move into more advanced technologies. Almost very close to an undeclared war over technology. But that's where the Biden administration is going. If Trump comes back, first of all, he wants, his sort of starting proposal was a 10% tariff across the board around the country and 50% on China, which itself would be a huge thing. But now he's talking about much more. He's talking about replacing income taxes with tariffs. All right, and that's aside from other things, it turns out to be mathematically impossible. It can't be done. But any significant move in that direction would be a huge increase in tariff rates. And just in general, we really are talking about the difference between an administration that has said, okay, we need to be a lot tougher and a lot more strategic, and we also need to think a lot more about the political economy of what we do than in the past, and an administration that would really be absolutely crude protectionism. I mean, bear in mind that if Trump is returned to office, the person who will probably be directing U.S. trade strategy is currently in prison, and when Peter Navarro comes back, it's going to be hell on wheels.
Okay, hell on wheels, that's a strong phrase. Let's come to perhaps a more cheerful perspective to you, Mr. Exarchou, with the legacy of the Greek crisis, and things are much, much different now in Greece. But how much does that history of what Greece has lived through affect the outlook today, and both in Greece and in Europe?
Well, the Greek crisis should have taught us a lot. And I think Greek people learn a lot out of this crisis, as well as other states, member states of the European Union towards the south. What we've learned is that when things are getting difficult, we're alone. What we learn is that although we have a common currency, when things get really tight, we have to protect ourselves by suffering. What Greek people managed to do, in my opinion, financially is unprecedented. It managed to avoid bankruptcy with the strongest currency in the world, with a huge debt that at that time seemed to be impossible to consider to be able to repay it ever. And we recovered from disaster mainly because the average Greek person accepted to suffer and to assume what was otherwise a private debt, accept to be a public debt and pay it from his pocket. However, what I'm particularly worried of is that European Union as a union didn't learn enough from what has happened. We see a situation and we call it a crisis because right-wing parties in Europe are getting significant support from voters. But we don't look why this is so. In my opinion, this is the biggest problem that Europe is facing currently. There is a huge disassociation of the agenda of Brussels with the average person. I was talking to a friend of mine, a farmer here in Greece, that was attempting to build a small renewable park, very small. And he told me something that really shocked me. I thought of it later, and I said, maybe he's right. He said, we are governed in practice by people that prefer to protect the European wolf, the European bear, but forget the fact that I'm unable to survive with what I'm producing. They give to the government no tools to protect me, and when I am unprotected, I'm looking at people that don't understand anything of my livelihood. The disassociation of the agenda of European Union currently with the average person in Europe is what creates what we called Euroscepticism. And that's a huge risk, in my opinion, because if we go back to the creation of European Union, it's a union created really to protect peace. And that was the initial intention of creating the single market and then the European Union. We reached a stage where European states accepted to pass some part of their sovereignty to Brussels. And Brussels needs to understand that unless they speak to the average person, unless they accept to go down a little bit and understand the needs of the average people, and eventually what they called Euroscepticism will be what happened in Britain, exit from Europe. And that is not something that anyone wants. European Union, in my opinion, is the only way forward for the continent. However, we cannot regulate every single activity of economy to the extent that Brazil is doing currently without actually deciding to spend, to produce something in Europe which is cheaper and competitive around the world. Most European projects are the most expensive around the globe, and we do nothing about that. We are getting expensive by the day. We are asking our people, our citizens in Europe, to pay the most expensive products ever, and we at the same time allow to import in Europe goods from countries that they act currently to human rights, contrary to human rights. It's okay to import goods that they are cheap from there, but we cannot export cheap goods anywhere in the world. We talk about AI, we regulate AI, we are spending thousands of days and man-hours to regulate AI, but we do not invest in AI. Americans do, other countries do, but not Europe. Unless Europe, which in my opinion is getting very old in mentality, unless it really reassess the whole arrangement, decides what exactly it is, whether it's a federation state or something else, and attempts to have a real close relationship with the average citizen in Europe, then what is currently happening in member states, right-wing, Euroscepticism, and all the rest, will eventually jeopardize the whole project of European Union.
So, Paul Krugman, when you hear that, do you see parallels with some of the political momentum in America and some of the fears in America of openness to the world that are potentially undermining the national economy?
Oh, sure. I mean, although there are big differences in history, and so U.S. politics is dominated by, in part, by a history that Europe does not have, the history of slavery. If you look at the political lines in the United States and look at a map of the Civil War in 1861, they're the same. So that is a difference, but these same things. The backlash against immigration is common. There's a lot of commonality between the MAGA movement in the United States and the right-wing parties within Europe, although I just wrote in today's New York Times that for what it's worth, the European right is less hypocritical than the U.S. right, because the U.S. preaches populism while simultaneously doing everything it can to hurt workers and enrich plutocrats. But still, and just look, the general sense that of many people that elites don't care about them or don't understand, that is common. In some cases, I think it's quite unfair, probably because I'm at some level part of the elite myself, but it's nonetheless something that needs to be addressed. And it's actually looking at the situation. We just had the elections in France. Looking at the various indicators, both of economic performance and of public opinion, the parallels between France and the United States are almost eerie. France hasn't had as much GDP growth, but it's actually had excellent employment growth under Macron. Inflation, there was a burst of inflation that's gone away, and yet consumer sentiment remains persistently depressed. And I could substitute Biden for Macron and the United States for France, and it would all be the same story.
Slightly younger in Macron's case than
yeah,
Biden.
Doesn't seem to have helped him much.
No.
But yes, no, that's true. I mean, but that's a. I have to say that it's not clear that there are many things going on here. It's not simply globalization. There is something about that burst of inflation certainly did a lot to, even though it was temporary, even though it was arguably what we should have done economically, did a lot to discredit elites, did a lot to rattle people's confidence. And just in general, if I had to say if there was an overarching story of the past almost 20 years now, it is that the public doesn't trust sophisticated elites in the way it used to, no longer believes that they know what they're doing, which is a fair assessment, because look at the financial crisis, look at the euro crisis, look at pandemic is a little bit funny, but still, we need to do a lot more, which is, in a way, comes back to where I was, that it's lecturing people on, here's what good economic theory says we should be doing, here's what the logic of globalization says we should be doing. That doesn't work. You need to find a way to actually sell people on the idea that this leads to better lives for them.
So let's talk about the art of the practically possible, because there's clearly somewhat of a disconnect between the theory and the practice and what works. So, Mr. Exarchou, what would you recommend? I mean, you listed complaints about the lack of understanding of the ordinary people and of the unfair competition. I think it would be a fair way that you described the challenge that many Greek industries face. What would you do about it?
The question is not what I would do about it. The question is what is the character that Europe wants to present to the world? I mean, US, for instance, is a federation. It's a state. It has one single currency. Every state within the federation is protected by the same currency. So when you have the tools to protect your economy at the federal level, you do. Europe doesn't. If for instance, exports need to be subsidized from one state, member state, but it's not allowed. I'm not saying that it should be allowed. I'm not saying that at the federation level, subsidies should not be controlled. Of course it should, but on a federation level, which protects everything. I mean, the needs of one country needs to be somehow regulated centrally. So Europe, in my opinion, needs to address a very important issue. Whether it is simply a common market or a federal state. This discussion should start, and I heard earlier someone of the speakers saying we need a new treaty. Of course we do, if we want to create a federal state of Europe. Otherwise, we need to reassess a lot of things. Because if the Greek state, for instance, is left alone at the time of crisis, without any tools to protect its currency, without any tools to protect its people, eventually the experiment will fail. So in my opinion, we can talk of a number of political or financial mechanisms, but the important thing is to decide what type of Europe we want. And clearly, we need to find a way to make Europe competitive again. It is not currently. And the way it goes, it loses competitiveness by the day. Europe needs to reassess its character and, again, obtain a real focus as to what it wants to be. We have a war in Ukraine, and we have been unable, due to lack of leadership, in my humble opinion, to react to this war because of different interests, I would say, from different member states. 15 years we're talking about immigration, we have not managed to find one single united way to solve this immigration problem. The US has done it. I mean, there are examples in the world that federal states have reacted to what we consider now for 15 years to be one of the biggest problems in Europe. But Europe doesn't have the leadership, in my opinion, to face this. So what I would do, I would readdress the question, what type of Europe the member states want.
But that could take quite a long time for Europe to decide what it wants to be. It's been grappling with that question for many years. So in the more immediate future, what would be your priorities for Europe to address the issues that you've outlined?
At the immediate level, we have the Greek example, in my opinion. We have a stable government the last few years that really tackled the problems to the extent it could in a very interesting way. It created the perception that Greece has changed completely. To some extent, it's correct. But it is not possible of any member state to solve the problem that comes from Brussels, in my opinion. And what you see now, politically, is an unsolvable problem. That's why I'm particularly not optimistic of the future of Europe. I understand that changing or creating a new treaty is not easy. It takes time. It shouldn't, because we are facing serious problems at the borders of Europe. The war in Ukraine is a huge example, and another one is the war very close to us, which is in Israel. We are unable to react to this, and we are unable also to react to competitive attempts coming from China. You see, I was reading recently a very, very interesting example of protectionism coming from China. The cars, the electric cars of the Chinese cars. You see, when the risk comes to the core of Northern European interests, European Union reacts. So immediately they increase tariffs to protect the European automobile industry from cars coming from China. This type of protectionism at the European level, in my opinion, should be developed and should be discussed in a way utterly different from what is happening now, the veto rights. Veto right means that no one is able to get the decision. Is the solution to waive the veto right? But waiving the veto right is a waiver of sovereignty. This type of problems that are not tackled at all at this level, in my opinion, create an unsolvable problem, which is we don't know if we are Greeks or Europeans.
So, Paul Krugman, it seems to me that to some extent, people looking at the other parts of the world, whether it's Europe looking at America or America looking at Europe, can sometimes see, I'm desperately looking for optimism here, but we've just heard that someone thinks that the American problem of immigration has been solved, but I'm not sure that's how it looks within the United States, where it's a very hot election issue as well. But if you look outside towards Europe, are there things that we're missing here in Europe that actually seem to you to be going better than we Europeans realize?
Oh, let me take the particular example of Ukraine, where it's a mixed picture, but there's a widespread impression in the United States that the U.S. is bearing the burden of supporting Ukraine alone, which is absolutely wrong. If you look at the dollar totals of aid or euro totals of aid, Europe has been a substantially bigger supporter of Ukraine than the United States has. There's a lot more money flowing from Europe to Ukraine. What there aren't flowing in sufficient numbers is arms, because the European defense industries are underdeveloped. Europe has neglected that. So the United States is critical on the military side, but Europe has risen to the occasion in terms of financial aid much more than people realize. It's actually one of the really good things. Now, what it has not risen to is sanctions. It's a real scandal just how many European goods are mysteriously being sold to Kyrgyzstan and so on, and obviously not stopping there. So, but Europe has actually been better on foreign policy right now than I think most people imagine. Europe, it's still. Let's just say that despite everything, despite all of the negatives, the European begins with the coal and steel community. The European moves towards the European Union were about peace within Europe, and so far that has held. There are things. It's still inconceivable. For a long time, wars between France and Germany were something that happened every few decades, and no one thinks of that as a possibility anymore. So there's a lot to be said, and let me also say that when it comes to, despite everything, when it comes to actually delivering a relatively decent quality of life to large numbers of people, Europe is still the place in the world. I mean, per capita GDP is lower than it is in the United States. Technology may be lagging a bit, but on the other hand, a lot of the difference in per capita GDP is because Europeans take vacations, which Americans don't. Certainly a very important part of the quality of life is actually not being dead. And the fact that we've got a sort of 4-year difference in life expectancy between Europe and the United States is an indication either that Europe is doing something right or that we are doing something wrong. So no, if I had to pick the kind of a Rawls thing, pick a part of the world, not knowing who you would be, a part of the world to be born into, I would pick Europe over the United States because despite everything, Europe has produced the most decent societies the world has ever seen.
I think that's probably a suitable place to end this on. Thank you for that note of optimism.
Okay.
The place to be born is Europe. You heard it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you.